Hi, my name is Ryan Langwish, and welcome back to Ludo Lodge, a channel about sparking growth in your journey as a game designer. And today I'm going to be continuing my series of prototyping in Tabletop Simulator, and specifically the sub-series of scripting in Tabletop Simulator. If you are new to this series and new to scripting in Tabletop Simulator in general, I would recommend starting with perhaps one of my earlier videos. I have an introduction video as well as some other that are a little bit more basic. This is actually kind of a response to some of those videos, pointing out something that kind of is a problem with some of the solutions I've done in the past. When I put together some of these examples, for example, automated card setup or the auto refill to locations, they're kind of isolated examples meant to demonstrate a specific thing with the scripting, but they're not necessarily in and of themselves a robust enough solution to be in a mod and really function as you would want it to. And there, specifically with the decks of cards examples we've been using, has been one key problem or thing missing from those examples that you would really want. And some of you in the comments have actually caught on to this or stumbled upon it in your own working in Tabletop Simulator. And that is around how we handle the GUIDs of our decks. So I'm actually going to pull out a deck here, just a standard deck of cards. And so Tabletop Simulator recognizes this as a deck, and you know that because when you hover it says how many cards are in the deck. And I'm actually, for purposes of example here, I'm going to make a smaller deck that's just 2 cards. So this is a deck here. And I'm going to look at the GUID of this deck. So we can see that here, CC, 6C, AC, lots of Cs. In the previous examples, typically how we've done things is we've copied that GUID, and then in our scripts, we've found the object by GUID to get our deck, and then we've used that deck object to do things like deal or move cards to certain locations, which has worked well in those examples, but only up into a certain point, which I will demonstrate by drawing this card off of here. You'll notice neither of these hover anymore to show the number of cards there, and if I go into here, this is a completely different GUID, right? It's not the one that had a bunch of C's in it anymore. And this one is going to be a different GUID. And that's because the second that you go from 2 cards to 1 card in a deck, in Tabletop Simulator's eyes, that's no longer a deck. You now have 2 cards. You have a single card and a single card. And each of those cards has their own GUID. But that deck that had a GUID is essentially gone. Like Tabletop Simulator is saying that deck no longer exists. You deconstructed that deck by distributing cards to the point that a deck no longer exists. And if you put it back together, I put this card back here. If I go look, this is not the original GUID, right? It's not the one with the C's. And that's because at this point, Tabletop Simulator is creating a new deck. It's saying, hey, you combined arbitrary cards into a new deck. I'll provide a GUID for that deck. And so this ends up being a big problem if all of your script is relying on a hard-coded GUID that you grabbed at the beginning of the game. Well, the second the deck gets down to a single card, that GUID is gone. And anything that's depending on that isn't going to work anymore, and it's not going to be able to recognize it. And obviously, it's common in games that you're going to get down to the last card in the deck or have, it's very common to shuffle the cards and put them back to create a new deck. And so all of those scripting examples are going to break if you've relied on that hard-coded GUID. So in this video, we're going to talk about how might you get around that to make it a little bit more or just less fragile so that it really can handle doing that deck scripting behavior without breaking the second that it gets down to that point. So I'm actually going to quick draw a box around this because the approach we're going to take now is instead of saying this deck's GUID, whenever we want to do something with the deck, we're instead going to ask what deck is at this location, on the board or in the play space. And so we're scripting it so that this is the spot for the deck, and as long as the deck is there, all of our scripting behavior should work, even if the deck ran out or we reshuffled or put a new deck there, because we're finding deck by location, we're not finding deck by some hard-coded GUID. And the way we accomplish this is by using the ever-useful scripting zones. If you are unfamiliar with scripting zones, they're just like other zones, such as hidden zones or hand zones or these kinds of things. So it's a three-dimensional box that you're defining. The difference with scripting zones is that they have no intrinsic function. Like, they do nothing as is. But what they give you the ability to do is in your script, I can now reference this and get information such as what objects are in this zone, or trigger an event when an object enters the zone or leaves the zone, which ends up being very useful, especially in a case like this, where that's what we're trying to ask, right? Is like, what deck is at this location? I like to come in and make it a little less tall, just as a personal preference. But we now have this zone that's going to represent, our deck zone of where we're expecting there to be a deck. Now, at this point, it is very important that you save your module before we get into scripting. And this is that reminder that I always have to remind myself. Everything we've been doing here, adding the cards, drawing this, adding the scripting zone, is is changes to kind of the component environment of Tabletop Simulator. And that needs to be saved separately. So I need to go into my empty deck scripting tutorial, and I need to overwrite it. And the reason that's so important is because once you get into scripting, whenever you hit save and play after you've written some scripts, it's going to load the last save file. It says that in the little hover here, which means if I didn't go in and save those things first, it would load and all these things would be gone because those weren't in the last save file. If you've been watching my videos, this is not the first time you've heard me talk about this, but I feel a need to keep repeating it, seeing as this is my second time recording this video because I made exactly that error and lost all of my things after I started into the script. So even if you've been doing it a lot, it's an easy mistake to make. So just a reminder that whenever you go into scripting, you want to kind of be at the point where you've finished most of how the component's going to be and saved it before you go to scripting. Let's get into this now. So we need to get the GUID of this scripting zone because we need to be able to reference it. If you right click a scripting zone, it automatically copies it to the clipboard. So now we can come in here and we're just going to stick in global here. And we're just going to make kind of a constant variable that has that GUID. Then we're going to have an onload function, which is just the standard event for once when the game first loads up, it's going to trigger this code. And we're going to use that as an opportunity to actually get our scripting zone. So we get it from that GUID. And we're going to save it in deck zone, which is not a local variable. We're not using local because we want deck zone to be usable or have the ability to reference it in any of our functions in this file, whereas local would only be within this function itself. So that gets us our deck zone. And now we want, in our script, like if we were scripting out a thing that's going to have a lot of automated scripting based on our deck, there's a lot of times we're going to want to get that deck and then take action on it. And in the past, we've gotten that deck much like we got the deck zone here, where we got it from its GUID. But that's what we're trying to avoid now. We don't want to use the deck's GUID because it's a very fragile value. Anytime the deck runs out, it's going to disappear. So instead, we're going to have a function called getDeck. And what getDeck is going to do is anywhere we want to, do something with the deck, we're going to call getDeck to have this function give us the proper deck that's at that location, or pass us a nil value if it didn't find a deck there. So the first step here is we want to ask what objects are currently in the deck zone. And the way you do that is we're going to make a variable called zone objects in this case. I am going to make this local because it's really only going to be used to help us get the deck within this function. And here we're going to use our deck zone, and a scripting zone has a method called getObjects. And this is just going to return a table or a list of all of the objects or components that are currently intersecting that three-dimensional box that we define, which could be, multiple things. It could be a bunch of things. So it is a list. The next step is we need to go through those items in the list, and we need to see, is there a deck in here? Because that's what we care about. We specifically want a deck. And there is going to be a little bit of a caveat when there's one card left, right? Because that's going to be a place where, for purposes of us players at the game, when there's one card left in the deck, we still consider that the deck. But Tabletop Simulator doesn't. It considers it a card. And so we need to make sure that we still are grabbing that to return from our getDeck function. But we're going to start out by looping over the objects that we grabbed from this zone. So I'm going to say we don't care about the index, so we're just going to use the underscore to skip it. But we do care about the item, and that's going to be in iPairs zone objects. And so each time through this loop, the item variable is going to have the next object in this list. And we want to ask, is that object a deck? So we're going to say if item, and the way you check like the type of an item or an object is going to be checking its tag. So all decks have a tag of deck. Very useful. And so if the item is a deck, we want to just return it, right? Because that's the result of getDeck. We found it and we returned it. Now, it is possible that there could be two decks or, 3 or more decks intersecting the zone. So for our purposes, we're just going to return the first one we find. The second, we find one that's a deck, we're going to return it. This function is finished. So that handles the case of if there's a deck in the zone. Like as long as there's a deck in there, it's going to eventually find it and it's going to return it. However, it's possible that it gets through all these iterations and never finds a deck. Well, what do we want to have happen then? Well, I mentioned that there's kind of this edge case of, well, what if there's a single card there? Which isn't a deck, right? It's just a card. We still want to treat that as the deck. So what I'm actually going to do is if we get to this point, let's just repeat the process of looping over those, but this time check for a card. And if we find a card, let's return it. Now you might wonder, well, could we combine that so we don't have to loop over it twice and have it be if it's a deck, return it, otherwise if it's a card, return it? It gets a little weird because if the ordering of the objects in deck zone, because what if there's a card and a deck? In that case, I think we want to use the deck, and we're getting a little bit into weird edge cases here. But I think we would want to use the deck over the card. So we want to make sure that even if the deck is later in the list than the card, I want to give it the first chance to grab a deck. Only if it doesn't find a deck do we want to loop and see, well, okay, were there any single cards in there? And if we find one, let's return that. Now, if we get all the way to here, that means it didn't find a deck. It didn't even find a card. And in this case, we want to return nil, which is going to that's the Lua value for nothing or null. And that's just telling whoever called this function, there is not a deck, at the location. Do what you want with that information, but there isn't. So how might we test this? I'm actually going to use something that I haven't used in a video yet, which is kind of a quick way to test something. So a lot of times I've been using buttons, showing how you might put a UI button out on the table and click it to do behavior. One other easy way to just test something if I don't want to go through the work of making a button is I'm going to use the onChat event. So this is a built-in event into Tabletop Simulator that this function is going to be called every time any user sends a chat message, which is kind of interesting. I've actually seen some interesting thing done in Tabletop Simulator mods where this method checks if the chat message is a specific command that it's looking for, and if so, takes certain actions, which basically lets the players, enter commands into the chat to change things about the mod or customize things, which is kind of cool. In this case, I'm just using it as my kind of like a button just so that I can trigger some of my code to see if it's working. And to see if it's working, I'm going to say getDeck, and I'm just going to deal a card. One card to the white player because it's currently what I'm assigned to. And so what we're expecting here is that when I send a chat message, it's going to grab the deck, and it's going to do that by checking the location, that scripting zone, getting all the objects, checking is there a deck in that location, return it. Otherwise, check if there's a card at the location, return it. Otherwise, return nil. And if it found something, it should deal it. Let's see what happens. So if we come here, let's put our deck in this location. And then let's come in the chat and let's just say test. We could say anything because it's just an on-chat method. And when we do that, you can see it took a card and it dealt it to me as the white player. And if I keep, doing chat messages, I keep getting cards. So that's perfect. That's exactly how we would want that. That piece of it seems to be working. But we do want to check some of the edge cases, right? Because we said we want it to work even if there's only a single card there. So let's see what happens. This is not a deck. Let's see what happens with one card. And it still works. And so what's happening there is it didn't find the deck, but then when it looped over to look for a card, it did find the card, and it returned it, and it dealt that to white. So that's perfect. However, and you may have caught this if you're paying close attention, there is still a problem, and that's if there aren't anything, or there's no deck or no card there. So if there's nothing there, you're going to notice I'm going to get an error. Error in script global function chunk. Attempt to index a nil value. Ooh, scary. What does this mean? If we go back into our script, let's think what's happening when there isn't a deck there. Okay, so it tried to find a deck, it didn't find one. It tried to find a card, it didn't find one. So it returned nil. So that's what got returned to getDeck. So then we actually tried to call .deal, the deal function, on nil. Well, nil doesn't have a deal function. It has no awareness of a deal function. Deal is something specifically that decks and cards, are programmed to know what that means and how they should behave. So we can't, that's going to be an error every time if we try to call a function on something that doesn't have that function. So really, before we decide to deal, we should be checking, is there a deck currently at that location? And we could do that here by just saying, if getDeck is not equal to nil, then we want to deal. And this should work, except I typed something wrong. Oh, I think I forgot if statements in Lua have a then. I'm guessing that's what it was. Yep. Little things like that. And again, depending on how familiar with it, that could be very hard to figure out, right? Exactly what's wrong. And so it is tricky. You got to kind of just get used to looking through and remembering, different things about Lua. And if it fails right away here, it's typically going to be a syntax error, meaning it's just something wrong with the Lua grammar. So my mind immediately went to, did I spell something wrong? Did I forget a keyword or something like that? So that's the place that you're going to want to look first. Well, let's see what happens now. I have my one card here, which if I chat deals to me, but if there's nothing there and I chat, nothing happens, which is exactly what we want, right? You could actually, flash a message to the users that's not an error message, but like a nice thing that says, can't deal because the deck is empty or something, to just give that information to the players. But the last thing I'm going to do here is I actually think it's a little cleaner. Instead of the problem with doing this check here is anywhere that we want to do something with a deck, we kind of always have to do this check, right? Because otherwise we're always going to run into these situations where we're dealing or calling functions that we shouldn't. And I think that's still going to be the case, but I think it's a little cleaner instead of having this exact logic in every location to just store that in a function. So I'm actually going to have a function that's called deck exists. And all that's going to do is return this value, which this value is evaluating to a Boolean, true or false. And so it's always going to be true or false. And so deck exists. If deck is not equal to nil, it's going to be true. If it is equal to nil, it's going to be false. And so anywhere that I want to do it, do anything with the deck, I can just say if deck exists, then getDeck, which is just a little bit cleaner. If ever this logic changed, I would only have to change it here, and the function could stay the same everywhere else. And that's pretty much it. You can see how this basically solves that problem, right? We're never going to have that issue of the scripting stops working once we get to a certain point. Because if we need to shuffle the deck and take it, maybe there's cards that different players have, they pass them in, there's a discard pile. We get it, we shuffle it, we stick it back in this location. our script is ready to go, right? Because it's just looking for a deck at that location, and it's going to handle everything correctly. In this case, we're just dealing to a player, but this works for anything that you would be getting a deck for in wanting to take actions on. And if you had multiple decks around the table, you could have multiple scripting zones, each with their own GUID, and specifically have different functions for getting specific decks based on the specific zones. So definitely a more robust solution. Hopefully this was helpful and kind of pairs well with some of those previous examples to kind of start putting the pieces together of how you could make something that really works well within your own mods. If you have any questions on this or other topics or topics that you'd like to see me cover, please drop those in the comments below. If you found this helpful, give the video a like, consider subscribing for more videos like this one, and I will see you in the next one.